喂，找不到。我现在可以开始泡茶是吗？
Welcome, Emu. It's wonderful to have you here. And it's a delight and a miracle, really, to see you here with us, with your Brian, um, in Yunnan, China. So welcome. Brian, do you want to unmute?
Thank you, Navi, and thank you, Terry. Imu Terry 刚刚说谢谢你的才艺，他也欢迎你来哈佛神学院的这个项目，很高兴有这个机会，欢迎啊。
谢谢。
Thank you, Terry.
We are so honored to have you in place in your Mon Khmer village, where you were born and raised in the tea fields of the Jingmai Mountains in southwest China.
他说我们很高兴你可以代表这个孟高棉语茶的关系，在你们景迈山芒景斋。
Recognized, we understand, as the oldest tea producing region in the world. And Brian was telling us that this is now being considered for UNESCO World Heritage status because of the fine ancestral teas.
现在景迈山在准备这个文化遗产，是因为景迈是全世界最古老的茶区啊。
Ancestral teas that your family has been tending for generations in the heartland of this global tea culture. So, Emu, what is the weather report from where you are right now?
请问亲爱的你那边的气候，给我们介绍一下。
嗯，今年的气候就是，像最近的夏天跟秋天的话，它雨特别多，然后今年的秋天本来是开门节后本来就没有雨，像往年都没有雨，但是今年就下了特别多的雨，每天到半夜上课的时候就会下很大的雨。然后还有去年的话，就是我们的西边没有云海，东边的话就会有云海。这个对茶叶还是会呃产生一定的口感的区别，香气的区别。
So Emu tells us that the last few months, from late summer into the autumn, there's been an extreme amount of rain, and even prior to that, normally in the mountains you see these beautiful, beautiful yunhai, oceans of clouds. So the village is sitting up at about 14 to 1600 meters elevation above the clouds, and there are certain aspects, especially the western aspect, where there haven't been any clouds in the valleys. So there's been some very conspicuous changes in the climate the last couple of years that the villagers not only perceive in the mountain environment, but also in the flavor of the tea, that there's a distinct relationship between the mouth feel and the flavor and the fragrance of the tea and the recent weather transitions.
So, climate change is affecting the teas, whether it's more moisture, the flavor, I hear you saying, Emu, and the consistency.
你的意思就是这几年的气候变化在影响茶叶的口感，是这样
对
吗？
对，因为今年的茶叶它的苦涩味没有去年前的那么重， 就像但是我觉得今年应该会稍微恢复一点，因为今年的云还出来了，但
嗯
是呢，今年雨就比较不太确定会不会可能恢复到之前的那种口感。
嗯。So the mouthfeel over the last couple of years has changed somewhat, and this past year's tea hasn't had as pronounced a bitter and astringent character as the tea normally has. And with pu'er tea, these are desirable qualities. So, and especially with all of the rain, it dilutes the flavor of the tea and changes their understanding of the nature of the tea.
Thank you for sharing that knowledge with us. I'm wondering if you could describe the tea fields to us for those of us who haven't been to your home ground.
你能不能给大家介绍茶园地的大环境？就像我们在山上一样，我们在看茶园地。嗯
嗯，我要怎么介绍这个大环境？比如怎么说？
就像我们在你的身边，我们在山上在看山上的环境，就给我们介绍一下茶园地是怎么样子的。
嗯，我们我们布朗族那个茶园地里面会有茶红树，但据说的话，就是最大的一棵是每个家里的每一家茶园地的那种主人或者是神柱一样的，但是它并不是说一定是树特别大的，它就叫茶红树，嗯，它是一定要有一个风水的这种光照的比较多的那个比较比较就是向阳的地方，所以我去到茶园，就是发现就是不一定特别大的树就是茶红树，有一些小的也会是茶红树，它不一定说是按照这种大小或者是年龄，他们是要看这个风水，然后去定这个茶红树的。然后我们那个呃山上在芒景这边就是海拔比较高，然后我们平时的茶园地还是在陡坡上的比较多一点，树荫也比较多，然后里面的昆虫还是很多的，所以我们的这个茶叶还是特别生态的，跟我们人是共生在这个景观上的。
So Imu started off by sharing with us that, and this is something that I should say is um, particular to their village, and I've read historical accounts about this from English explorers into Burma. However, in China, as many tea villages as I've been to, including Bulong villages, hers is the only village I've actually ever encountered this in. And what that is that in every tea garden, every old growth tea garden, there's one tea tree that the local people refer to as the Cha Hun Shu, the tea spirit tree. And I had originally understood it to be the largest and oldest tree in every village, or in every garden rather. And what Imu pointed out is that it's not necessarily the oldest and largest tree. There's also the consideration of the vantage point of the tree and the feng shui of that particular tea garden. So when we go into the Jingmai Mountains and into these Bulong villages, we'll find a totem pole, so to speak, a wooden carved totem erected under a tree with a small woven bamboo basket next to it in which offerings are placed. And just to elaborate a little bit on what Imu shared, the first harvest of these tea spirit trees is given to the headman of the village, Imu's great uncle, and that tea will go into social projects for the village and for community development.
Thank you so much for sharing that story, Imu, about the tree. It's fascinating. And I so honor your ancestors and the generations that have contributed to these beautiful pu'er teas that you are continuing.
Terry 说，我们在这边特别尊敬、特别崇拜你的祖先，我们就没有想过，茶文化有这种就是一代人传给一代人的茶文化，所以我们就特别感谢你的祖先，也特别感谢你，还在做这件事情啊。
So I have two more questions. One, my husband Brooke and I were able to go to the Yunnan province in China. And when we were walking among some of the tea fields, we heard women singing. And I'm wondering if in your village and in your family's tea fields, are there particular songs associated with each field, or are there tea songs in general? I remember it being so hauntingly beautiful among the women.
前几年 Terry 跟他的先生去过云南，也去过茶园地，那时候采茶的女人都在唱歌。他要问你，布朗族有茶歌吗？你们采茶的时候会不会唱？然后呢，有没有什么特别在采茶的歌？
我是不会，但是我奶奶特别厉害。我奶奶，我听我奶奶的徒弟说，就是我奶奶去到原始森林里、茶园里，她看到那个树叶飘下来，她都能写一首布朗族歌。然后他们以前唱歌的那种是情歌对唱，或者是采茶的时候，因为唱歌都就不会觉得累嘛，心情愉悦嘛，就觉得采茶也不辛苦，所以他们就在采茶的时候会唱采茶歌，或者是情歌对唱，就是男女对着唱那种，会有的，但是现在特别少。
So Emu can't sing, but her grandma, and this is her grandma on the altar behind me. She said was 特别厉害, was really great singer, and her grandmother carried the song cycle of their village for several decades, and grandma's protege, her disciple, would tell Emu that in the past, when grandma was out in the mountains picking tea and a tree would fall in the woods, grandma could just off the top of her head improvise a song and improvise a story about the falling of the tree. And for the Bulong in the past, it was very common while picking tea to sing two types of songs. One is the call and response between lovers, between a boy and a girl. And the other is simple songs around picking tea. And that because this work is so exhausting, that these songs were intended really to keep people's spirits up while they were harvesting. So this was something that was very common in the past, but we're experiencing that less and less at the present.
Thank you for that. And I have one more question.
还有一个问题，最后一个问题。
I think I'm asking this for all of us who are listening, and delighted to see Brian in his fullness rather than just his hands, which we've come to appreciate as he framed our weather reports. How did you two meet? And what role did tea play in your romance?
亲爱的 Terry，想问一下，我们两个是怎么认识？他说到现在，大家每个礼拜看我在泡茶，但是在这个茶艺的过程当中，只能看我的两只手，没有看我的脸。现在大家在看我，他们也在看你，他们要了解一下，我们是怎么认识，还有会不会跟茶叶有关系的？
嗯，我俩认识就是跟茶叶也有很大的关系。还有跟我的家族也有很大关系，因为我爸爸是中医草医，然后你也是一个人类学者，就经过苏国文老师，然后认识了我爸爸，之后我们两个变成朋友。刚开始的时候，我们两个没怎么聊天，后面加了微信之后呢，才慢慢的开始聊，然后嗯，就就这样，
嗯
因
，so
他而言。
so um, with
I'm sorry to put you on the spot. This is really personal, but I know people are wondering, as am I.
not at all, and absolutely has a relationship with tea, and a little further on, more of the story might be revealed, but excuse me. Um, the short version is that because Emu's father is the village doctor, he's an indigenous herbalist with some training in Chinese medicine. And because of my background in medical anthropology, that I first arrived in the village to work with the village headman, Su Guowen. And Su Guowen is a truly remarkable individual, and he's also Emu's great uncle. And having met the headman, a good friend asked me if I had met Dr. Su, and I hadn't at that point. And they said, next time you go to the village, you should meet Dr. Su. So my future father in law and I became very good friends, and I would often visit their house. And from the time Emu was young, she's somebody who isn't fond of reading, but absolutely loves to learn. And growing up by her father's side, there were artists and scholars and doctors, tea people constantly visiting her home. And when they would visit, her father would have Emu brew tea while he entertained.
Mm.
And so that was Emu's education. And that's where we met, is over the tea table while I was in conversation with my father-in-law.
Mm.
And Emu sat quietly and listened while serving us tea.
Mm.
And shortly thereafter, we exchanged information and started communicating a little bit, and like liking each other's photographs on WeChat, and just starting to develop a friendship. So um, the one thing I'll add that Emu didn't, and I think this is true for both of us, is that unlike previous relationships, it wasn't intense early on. It was a gradual unfolding friendship based on my relationship with the family that eventually brought us closer and closer out of a very shared sense of tea and of reverence for the Bulong people.
Thank you so much, Emu, for your grace and for showing us the beauty and elegance of a tea ceremony. And I hope one day we meet. And thank you for sharing what you know, just a little bit of it tonight. We're so grateful.
Emu, Terry 想谢谢你今天让我们大家认识很温柔的苏一姆，还有给我们大家介绍 你这个很优雅的茶艺，给我们一个机会认识一点点，希望以后我们还会有机会啊，谢谢今天的缘分。
好的，谢谢，谢谢你们大家，很希望你们能来到中国，来到景迈山。
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Terry. And Imu welcomes you all to Yunnan and to the Jingmai Mountains.
Well, it's a joy to have you with us, Imu, and I hope you'll stay with us throughout as Brian and I begin our conversation as well. For those of you who have just joined us, I'm Terry Tempest Williams, writer in residence at the Harvard Divinity School. And on behalf of the school, the Center for the Study of World Religions, Religion and Public Life, and the Planetary Health Alliance in relationship to the Constellation Project, we're so happy to have you here with us tonight. As you know, this is our last weather report, the climate of community, which is a reveal of Brian Kurbis. We've come to know and appreciate his hands, his elegant hands that have been framing our weather reports. And we're so happy to have his wife and partner, Sue Yimu, discussing tea as she knows it as an Indigenous woman in these beautiful fields known worldwide. And tonight, Brian and I are going to be discussing, how tea can literally serve us during this time of climate chaos and why it matters. And we'll also be discussing Imu and Brian's project and business of Teosophy as a sustainable grace of tea culture. I was noting that in the Book of Tea, Okakura Kakuzo writes of the tea master, quote, "The tea master held that real appreciation of art is only possible to those who make of it a living influence. Thus, they sought to regulate their daily life by the high standard of refinement, which obtained in the tea room. In all circumstances, serenity of mind should be obtained, and conversation should be so conducted as never to mar the harmony of the surroundings. Great has been the influence of the tea master in the field of art, but it is nothing compared to that which they have exerted on the conduct of life," unquote. And this has been my experience working with Brian Kurbis. Brian Kurbis, so that you know, was born into a lineage of foresters and farmers and is trained in environmental and medical anthropology. He's conducted independent research through affiliation with the Yunnan University's Museum of Anthropology, and simultaneously apprenticed under Chen Zhen of Yung Hai Jurdin. His wife and partner in Teosophy, Su Yimu, was born and raised in Mongjing village, Jingmai Mountain, into a line of succession that goes back to the beginnings of tea culture. She's apprenticed in artisanal tea production under her father, Bulang herbalist Su Wenxing, for over a decade. A quick origin story of how Brian and I met. In the desert of hamlet of Castle Valley, where Brooke and I, my husband and I live, there's been an exquisite tea practitioner named Sarah Hedden, who has shared her gifts of tea culture and ceremonies with us through the years. And it's made an extraordinary difference in the solidarity and sustaining grace of our community. In times of crisis, in times of loving engagement, and in daily life, Sarah has joined us together through her graceful intelligence and knowledge of tea culture. During the pandemic, I asked Sarah if she would pick out a special tea that both of our families might drink together during these months at home for strength, sustenance, courage, and peace of mind, body, and strength. And pondering as she does, she finally selected a very fine pu'er tea from Teosophy called Original Ecology. I placed her order. What I wasn't expecting was the response from Brian Kurbis. It was loving. And alongside the pu'er tea that Sarah selected, he sent a tea in also a cake form called Feral Nature, with a nice note regarding my work, which of course was a surprise. I was both amused and touched by his humor, which it's a beautiful wit. And a friendship across the miles ensued. With Sarah Hedden and her refined understanding of tea, we drank many cups of original ecology. And when we felt spirited, we drank Feral Nature. It calmed and nourished us. And our families, now a pod, grew closer around this ritual of tea as we shared the truth, the terror, and the vitality of the struggles of our lives, individually and collectively, during that time, as we experienced the land in continuous drought and the country plagued by COVID. This now, drinking tea together, has become a continuum of practice and purpose in place. This is the climate of community. And when the idea of Weather Report series was being imagined at the Harvard Divinity School with many members of the community involved, I could not imagine that it would happen without the elegant intelligence of Brian Kurbis, understanding the role of tea in a civil society, a society of humility and hospitality. And so I called him to ask if he would consider framing these conversations with a tea ceremony of sorts. He was more than generous. He became an integral part of the creation of these conversations, committing each week to comprehensive research of each witness and storyteller, creating a tableau, as it were, a tableau, and subtle artistic narratives that would hold the tea pouring in place, an idea, providing a spiritual context for softening our minds to receive the conversations that were to follow. For those of you who have stayed with us, you can recognize them as pieces of performance art. Brian's creations and tea practices were always a surprise to us. And what followed after each weather report was an imagining and debriefing with Brian and those of us working on this series. Where I often contained fire, Brian contained water. And with each of our many private conversations, his wisdom and composure always deepened the public outcome. What I've learned from you, Brian, is trust. I trust your integrity and love of tea. I trust that you needed to be part of this series. And I trust that you created and would continue to create what was needed each week. You trusted us, you trusted the process, and you were always prepared and present and brought meaning to what we were doing. This is the climate of community. And I think all of us at home and here at Harvard Divinity School, thank you. I also will say that there were those like my dear father who wanted to fast forward the tea ceremony, impatient, wanting to get straight to the point of the conversations. So be it. Understandably, this was not the usual public offering seen at Harvard University. But for those of us who are with you, stayed with you, and opened ourselves to your nuance, Brian, of your tea practice and pouring, we were gifted and graced by your quiet prologue and settling aftermath of words. So it's my great joy and privilege to introduce everyone as a true reveal, Brian Kurbis embodied, with all of our sincere gratitudes. Welcome, Brian. And what's the weather report you want to bring to us?
Hi, Terry. And first of all, thank you. I have such a debt of gratitude to you. And I also have such a debt of gratitude to Harvard. And also to our viewing audience. I feel, as you pointed out, that there's a certain amount of tolerance involved in my participation in this event. And I have to say that you also challenged me to explore something outside of my own comfort zone. I've been brewing tea in China, in Chinese, for groups in its original homeland for a decade and a half. And I feel like this was one of the most challenging brewing experiences of my life. And it's so humbling to allow myself to be open to and to receive your words. And I feel like if there's anything I would choose out of Okakura Kakuzo's Book of Tea, it may not have been what you chose. It might have been earlier on where Kakuzo gets into a critique of the relationships between the East and the West. And he points out that this might be a little bit unseemly of a tea man to engage in this type of discourse. However, if it be unseemly, then let it be said that he's an ornery tea man. So that was really my challenge, is to, along with you, create a container to hold these powerful voices and conversations, and to balance that relationship of emptying us all to prepare us for these conversations, but also to show another way to experience tea and to speak to the capacity of tea. So I just want to thank you for that, first of all. As for the weather, these last few months I've been living in McKinleyville, unceded land of the Yurok people up here in Humboldt County, Northern California. And despite the hardship of having been in the US for the last couple of years and being separated from Emu and being separated from the tea gardens, since COVID really set in, I couldn't have asked for better hospitality and refuge in this time away. I spent a little bit of time in Portland, and I spent a little bit of time with family in Southern California, and recently in Humboldt. The weather is superb, even when there are fires burning to the east. We wake up every morning to mists, and we watch the mists roll in the evenings before the light fades. And I'm also staying with a very dear friend who is an exceptional guide to the wilderness of Northern California and an avid jade hunter. And I told myself that jade, being the quintessential Chinese substance, would certainly be in my future, that there would be one day where I'd want to learn a little bit about this precious substance with so much symbolic power and cultural power. And never did I think that I would learn about it in its primal form by walking the rivers and streams of Northern California and learning how to train my eye to this essential substance that is formed at deep places in the Earth's crust, and then is lifted up to mountains and then eroded and travels in these rivers. So there's such a sense of like completion in terms of the weather and the climate of my own experience and my relationship to China and to this place. So
Well, we're so
I hope
grateful
that
to you.
I hope
You
that
know,
constitutes a weather report. But that's where I am, and that's, yeah.
I love that image of jade in all of its manifestations, and also the power that it holds in China. I'm wondering, we've been talking about origin stories, Emu's origin in these ancient generational fields of tea of her ancestors. How you and Emu met, how you and I met, with Sarah as a bridge. I'm wondering what your origin story is in terms of tea and ultimately theosophy.
So whenever people ask me this question, I always think about how far back to go. And since people don't generally frame it as my origin story, they might frame it as, how did you get interested in tea? They, aren't asking the same question as you are. And so, again, I think for people to indulge me a little bit, to truly go back to the beginning, um, I was born on a Marine base. I was born on Camp Lejeune in North Carolina when my father had just returned from the Vietnam conflict. And he had just returned from war, and my mother had just finished nursing school. So I was born in this, what I think of as a liminal space between Southeast Asia and the United States, in the middle of what I also have come to see as our own small c, small r cultural revolution in the United States. And there's a sense of duality and a sense of conflict in all of this. And in my early childhood, I found myself in Southern California in a free love, free drug, post-Vietnam, post-60s environment. And it felt at the time like pure, unrestrained creative energy. I was a young Leo with hair halfway down my back, hanging out with bikers and hippies in the mountains of Southern California, until my mother passed away. And I lost that connection to the maternal and to what I think of as the divine feminine. And my grandparents felt that it was in my sisters and my interests to bring us back to our family farm, to my mother's family farm, and took us away from my father, who was really searching and really suffering after coming back from the war. And so from a very early age, from the age of 5, 6 years old, I was already starting to think about these dialectical relationships between the patrilineal and the matrilineal, the archetypal mother and father, and East and West coasts, this tradition and modernity, the progressiveness of Southern California and the conservatism of the East Coast, as well as it came into my understanding, my awareness, this experience of the United States and Southeast Asia and the role that China peripherally played in that. And so from a very early age, I was searching for a container, as it were, big enough to contain these ruptures in my childhood experience. And as I grew up on a Mennonite family farm, a working family dairy farm, I was very hostile to the experience, lost my father in my early teens, and really just saw myself as I would call it, an indentured servant on my grandparents' farm, and felt that while I was being provided food, clothing, and shelter, I didn't feel the love or the spiritual support that I was after. And what I did have access to was a Baptist church and youth group, and I was a very active participant and very curious about the Bible, until I started asking questions that my Sunday school teachers weren't able to answer, and I started looking elsewhere. So ended up running away from the farm, going to school early on at University of Buffalo in Western New York, and that was my 60s, I suppose. My exploration of mystical systems of Kabbalah and Sufism and Taoism and just comparative mythology and psychedelics. It was my moment to kind of go through that searching and to do this exploration. And it was constantly oriented towards that resolution that I had sought from the time I was young. So, as they say, when a student is ready, a teacher will appear. I met somebody who was a Taoist practitioner. He was a Western practitioner of a Chinese martial and healing system. And here it just felt natural that in trying to understand my parents' essences, these parents who I never really knew, but it was incumbent upon me in terms of my own search for an identity and for an honoring of my ancestors to explore this relationship between violence and healing. And that really became my path. So
So
I went down that road, and
where did tea come in?
so where tea came in is that eventually I moved from Western New York to Southern California. I lived in the mountains for a while, working in restoration ecology, managing a nursery, working with National Forestry, and eventually realized that education would be a way for me to start participating in the world, that it wasn't enough just to hang out on my mountain. As much as sometimes I wonder if I made the right choice, I've always felt that there was a relationship between responsibility to self and to other and to the world. And so I went back to school, and a lot of my early writing and early research at UC Santa Cruz pertained to the culmination of my interest in plant human relationships and the evolution of consciousness. And that was Datura, what we call in the vernacular Jimson weed, and that you and I have discussed, and I know grows just all around your home in Castle Rock.
I mean, just to inhale it is an intoxication and alters the mind, I have to tell you. Just
It is, yeah, yeah.
the fragrance and the unfurling of that.
And that was the thing. I think that it's Datura is one of the most poisonous, most toxic plants in the world, but it's also, I would argue, the most sacred plant in the world. A caveat being that tea, whether or not it supersedes it or occupies that space, is also one of the most profound plants that humans have developed a relationship with. And the thing about Datura for me is that it straddled that line, that dualistic space, or that dialectical space between a poison and a potion, between a toxic and a tonic.
You know, Brian, there was a moment where Sarah Hedden brought some tinctures that had been properly curated, and we put a few drops inside that pour tea of yours. And I have to say, it was a dilation of both the mind and heart. And we certainly didn't take it for granted. But I appreciate what you're saying. Just again, thinking about what Michael Pollan was talking about, you know, this is our mind on plants. And so I echo what you're saying about Datura. And that's interesting to me, the confluence of Datura and sacred Datura and your teas.
And during that time, I was living in Southern California, and I was spending a little bit of time on the Morongo Reservation, and with the in doing research, independent ethnobotanical research on the Cahuilla peoples and the Serrano. And the one thing that really compelled me about Datura is that, and at that time, it was unknown whether it had old world origins or new world origins. And I think, according to scientists, the answer is in, and they assert that it is a New World plant, but there's still a significant amount of evidence to the contrary. But we find it at this point growing all around the world, and wherever we find Datura, it tends to be at the very center of people's, indigenous people's ritual lives and their cosmologies and their worldviews. And what I felt that I had found in this plant is a singular plant substance that gave us access to a universality, to a unified worldview. And that was the resolution I had been seeking. But when I went back to school, two things happened. One, I was given an opportunity to travel to China, And we were going to travel from the north of Thailand to the Himalayan plateau. And this is an extremely, extremely special region. So from northern Thailand to the Himalayan plateau is one of the steepest ecological transects in the world. And as you rise in elevation, you have distinct microecologies and you have distinct ethnic communities. So consequently, it's also one of the most biodiverse and culturally diverse regions in the world. Such a special place. And at the last minute, the project was canceled, and I pushed an independent study through my department, and they sent me off with their blessing to Yunnan. And I arrived in Yunnan and didn't know a soul. And within about 5 days, I had full academic access from Yin Shaoting, who was the foremost scholar of indigenous agriculture in Yunnan province and the head of the Museum of Anthropology. And I had also, in those first few days, met Chen Jian, who you mentioned, who would take me on eventually as a formal disciple and apprentice in tea culture.
I so appreciate all of us being able to hear this of your path, because I think especially with our students, it shows them the wanderings, and the questions that we hold. And I think it might be interesting for each of us to contemplate what our own origin story is that has brought us to this moment. And with the gifts that are ours, how we can continue these weather reports in our own lives with the concentric circles. And we have about 15 more minutes before we close. And I'm wondering, Brian, two questions I have. One, why tea? And how can tea literally serve us in the midst of this climate chaos and collapse? And what you and Emu want to do with your idea of Teosophy and this World Heritage Site that I think is such a beautiful integration of ancestors, origin stories, and the work that is ours at this moment in time.
Well, first, I think just to speak a little bit to the students that you just mentioned and my relationship with the Academy, because, and this proceeds from where I left off in the story, because I wasn't very familiar with Kunming. Whenever I had to meet with a professor or have a small gathering of scholars, I would call them and I would say, how about you come to this tea house? Because I don't really know my way around the city very well. And so I feel like I had arrived in Kunming, and so much of my preparation up until that time was intellectual preparation. And I'd read all of the right literature and written papers and done all of that work, but I slowly came to realize that, as it said, it's easier to proceed from ignorance to wisdom than from wisdom back to ignorance. And that at that point in my journey, tea was going to become a fulfillment of this path of the heart, and that I needed to learn how to drop my intellect down into my heart. And tea really guided me on that journey. I left after my initial 3 months in Kunming, or in the Tea Mountains in 2006, just overwhelmed that the Tea Mountains could have been as generous and have opened themselves up to me like they did, and that China could have opened itself up to me like it did. And I went back year after year, from 2007 to 8 to 9 to 10, for the next several years. And year after year, Yunnan and the Tea Mountains just continued to open themselves up more and more deeply. And it finally dawned on me that what it was is that tea was allowing me to open my own heart and find a path in the world, and that there was a mutuality between the place and my own journey, the way I perceived and participated with that place. And if we look to the ancient origins of tea as a substance, as a plant medicine, uh, it's considered a bitter substance in Chinese medicine, and bitter has an affinity with the heart. And we often hear that in Yunnan Tea Society. They'll say, 用心做茶, 用心泡茶, 用心 is use the heart to make tea, use the heart to brew tea. And those were some of the first words that my future mentor told me early on when I had met him, is that to understand tea, we need to empty our own hearts. Because whatever's in our own heart, the tension that resides in our heart, the grief that exists inside of our own heart, is going to express itself in the tea. If we're anxious, the tea is going to reveal that anxiety in the cup. And if we can empty our own hearts, then we can reveal the true nature of the tea. And if we are able to do that, then we are able to receive guests in a befitting manner. And this speaks to the relationship between host and guest, to empty ourselves and to be of service to other people, and to listen and to use our craft, use our art to reflect people back at themselves, just like tea has taught us to reflect back on ourselves and purify through that process. So
It's so beautiful. I love that idea of emptying our heart, and of being of service to something larger than ourselves. I think that's so important as we think back over these 10 weeks of the storytellers that we've had, because I think on some level, each person that shared their origin stories, that shared their gifts, that shared their struggles, emptied themselves, emptied their heart in the service of something larger. And I think that's the mosaic. Those are the tessera pieces that I think will allow us to reimagine the world and to reshape it. In terms of Theosophy, Brian, it is your business, you and Emu, but it's also a philosophy and a project. Can you talk about that?
I'd love to. Thank you. As you said, it's a small artisanal tea shop, so it is a business. But prior, for me, just in terms of the etymology, te, the first four letters, was the original botanical name for tea. When tea traveled out of China into the West, it took on the name Te sinensis, and Te comes from a pronunciation for tea in the Chinese dialect, and eventually Linnaeus changed that to Camellia sinensis. So Te is not only the name for tea, but in Latin, it's also the divine feminine. It's the feminine form of Theo, or the divine. So it has Western connotations as well, and this is so important. And Sophie, of course, wisdom or knowledge. So this is tea wisdom, but it's also wisdom of the divine feminine. And the name came to me so simply and so clearly. However, I doubted for a moment, because I was very aware of the 19th century theosophical movement. And I had to think about it for a moment. Did I want my tea project associated with, maybe perceived of as, Western occultism? And so I had to do a little research on that. And this is something that
On Theosophy, right?
on Theosophy and Helen Blavatsky, and
Which I have to tell you has part of its origin story is in the Center for the Study of World Religion here at Harvard.
well, I know that Charles Stang is doing research on Western theosophical tradition. And that was the resolution to my problem. And that's just like your homeopathic dose of datura in my tea. I think the true reason for this destiny that you and I share, and this the basis for this conversation, I realized that theosophy was actually a Western wisdom tradition that went back at least to the 3rd century AD and to Ammonius Saccas, and it has a long, long history. And now, as I passionately pore over medieval um, hermetic and alchemical texts of people like Jacob Boehm and others, I see theosophy written into and illustrating these texts. And this is so essential to this project because tea is eminently a Chinese substance. And I speak to that. And I say that tea is a container for the Chinese worldview. For me, it contains the divine feminine in the Taoist sense of being a backwards path of the moon and a return to our original nature. However, one thing that Carl Jung pointed out when he wrote a commentary on a Chinese meditation manual is that the biggest mistake Western practitioners of Eastern traditions can make is to forsake our own stories and our own ancestors and our own truths. And if we're not doing the work in our own cultural milieu, then we may not actually be doing the work. There's so much healing and there's so much reconciliation. And I feel like, and this is something that Charles mentioned in his conversation with Michael Pollan, is that lest people should feel that in his claiming to be an animist, he's appropriating indigenous culture, that we have an animist tradition in the West as well. And animism is considered to be the origin story of all world religions. It's simply the relationship between human beings and the natural world. And it's a way of creating a sense of equanimity and dynamic equilibrium with the world. So for me, Theosophy is the path of tea. It's the story of tea, but it's also an origin story for Western society. And I feel that if we can claim our own ancestry and invoke our own traditions in the same way that the Chinese do, then we start to arrive at a shared language and a shared origin story. And there's so much beautiful research being done nowadays on like Silk Road era and Roman Empire era communication and exchange between East and West. And there are conversations happening, I think, far before we realize it. And there was a conversation taking place and a mutual influence and a symbiotic relationship taking place between East and West. And it's really compelling for me to think that these can, in some ways, be invoked as a response to the problems of modernity and a lot of the kind of geopolitical and intercultural gaps in our capacity to heal the planet.
I so appreciate this, Brian. And I feel that in so many ways you are acting as a translator. I mean, just as you've been translating the conversation between Emu and myself, and I so appreciate that she took the time, as exhausting as it is, to speak in translation, to share with us her traditions, the knowledge of that spirit tree, of the songs that are passed down through the women, through time, through her lineage, and that you are a translator of East and West. And in the same way that you were a translator, I think, through tea with our conversations. And I so appreciate this. And in closing, Brian, I'm wondering if you could share with us the quote that you were telling me about the other day of Wendell Berry, because I think you come from a lineage of farmers as a Mennonite. And you have married into a family of tea, and in the global tea center, the heart of this tradition. And it strikes me that Wendell Berry also is a translator between the land and the lyric. Could you
If
read?
it's okay, if it's okay, I'm going to respond and deflect into another quote. And I have so much admiration for the legacy of Wendell Berry, which is the legacy of the American Transcendentalist movement, which segues into the Theosophical movement and into the 20th century, into the Beat generation and folks like Gary Snyder, of course. And um, I hadn't prepared the Wendell Berry quote, but that's just that's the place I'm at. I'm really aspiring to just move back to the farm. And so this is a going home story for me, in as much as that home is now in China. And the quote that I did prepare is the quote from Paulo Freire's A Pedagogy of the Heart. And the original title of that book was Underneath the Mango Tree, or Beneath This Mango Tree. So for Paulo Freire, it was a mango tree, and for myself, it's a tea tree. And this is from the second paragraph in that book. And what he says is that there has to be an a priori reason that has been lost in the pleasure of finding refuge under the shade of this tree. What I should do is totally let myself be taken by the feelings of being under it, to live it, and to make this experience more and more entire. Oh, I'm sorry, more and more intense, to the extent that I prove its existence. And just to recall briefly again this conversation between Michael and Charles, and Michael commented that he'd be interested in a proof for animism. And Charles said he doesn't know that it lends itself to this kind of proof. Now, I think this is the a priori reason that I find myself under this tree. And I'm committed in my own way to proving the existence of that a priori reason. I feel like we do all have access to a proof of animism. However, it's a tacit proof, and it resides within our own hearts. And as Emerson says, in light of all the evidence, nature is a discipline. It's not just dwelling in emptiness and dwelling in isolation or separation from the world. It's really in cultivating emptiness so that we can feel the fullness of the world and of the creative principle that much more fully, to cultivate that inner emptiness, that emptiness of the heart, and from that space of emptiness to experience the creative principle
I
and
think
allow that light
idea
to guide us.
the creative principle, because I think that's really, whether it's a tea pouring, whether it's the conversations that we've had, whether it's the commitments that our students are now making to being of service to something larger than themselves, the emptying out, as you say, of the heart. This is what you've given us, both you and Imu, with her cup of tea and her ritual today, in framing this. So could we say good night to Imu? I just want to thank her again.
Imu, 你能听得见吗？
听得见啊。
Terry，我们现在就差不多了。Terry 要跟你说晚安。 其实是这边的晚安，是你们的早上啊。I just saw Terry, so it's actually morning for Emu. I'm not sure if she's going to go back to sleep
I realized
or
that.
not. And for the two of us, it's a constant joke about saying good morning or good night to the other because it's never consistent for the two of us. But thank you. And 亲爱的，你
Thank
有
you
没有
so
最
much.
后一句话？
And Brian, in closing, I'm going to just give a few thank yous, and then I'll leave the closing words to you and Emu as you close our series of weather reports. I want to thank each of you at home for staying with us, for allowing these conversations to unfold organically, because witnessing does matter. It is not a passive act. It is an act of consequence, conscience, and consciousness, which I think is a common theme that we have had throughout these 10 weeks. Thank you for bringing the weather reports into your own home. And I hope that each of us will think about our origin stories and what piece we have to give as we empty our hearts into the larger community, the climate of community that beckons us now. I really want to thank from the deepest parts of my heart, Judy Beals for her leadership and professionalism in really directing these weather reports. So thank you, Judy. And Navi Harden, who has been here night after night after night after night with his grace and stamina with the technologies, and blessings to you, dear Navi. I want to thank the CSWR staff, Joanna Wagner at the Planetary Health Alliance, and certainly the Harvard Divinity School communications team, development team, and Diane Moore, who leads the religion and public life program for her class with her students that used these weather reports as the spine of the curriculum. And also Ana del Castillo, with our remarkable students who made these conversations come alive as co-creator of our fire salons. To Mary Frank, thank you for your beautiful art and presence, your insistence that this not be called the climate of uncertainty, but the climate of now. You are one of our elders. And for Christy Welsh for creating the striking poster with Mary's image. I also want to extend my gratitudes and deep bows to Charlie Stang and Sam Myers, who are my partners in the Constellation Project in these ongoing cross-disciplinary conversations. I want to thank the endless support and belief and faith of Dean David Hempton for allowing this to happen, for supporting it, and for bringing on his wisdom. Also, the Associate Deans of Faculty and Students, Janet Giazza, who was a participant in the Climate of Consciousness, and also Melissa Bartholomew, Associate Dean of Diversity and Inclusion and Belonging, for her constant prayers. Also, a special thank you to Dan Schrag, the director of the Harvard University Center for the Environment, and Alex Griswold for his help in technology. Finally, I just want to alert you that our students here at the Harvard Divinity School have asked that they have a chance to talk about what these weather reports meant to them. And they're going to do this next Monday, December 6th at 7 Eastern Time. And I hope that you will join with them as they talk about the ongoing themes that matter to them, about both their struggle and empowerment as a generation who is facing climate collapse, and how these conversations have stirred them, and how they plan to put their hope into action. And we hope you'll join them in the discussion that will be led by our own beloved Ana del Castillo, who is a climate research fellow at the Religion and Public Life program. She's a research associate. So that's something to be looking forward to with 5 of our students. Lastly, I want to say that the weather report series has been supported by the generous private donations made to the Constellation Project by the Children's Trust and the Jesse and Betsy Fink Foundation and the Susan Shellcross Sports Endowment. And we're so grateful for their belief in this work on behalf of ethical actions for the planet and these interdisciplinary conversations. This is the climate of community. And blessings to you all as we recall Bernadette Dementiev's call to action. All hands on deck. Everyone, here, now, together. All hands on deck with the gifts that are ours. And I just want to thank you for all of your support, for being here and responding, and stay tuned because I suspect weather reports to come. So the last word, Brian and Emu, is yours tonight as you carry us out.
So Terry asked if we could do a closing tea, and I said that I would offer a cup to everybody, and I just have 2 very small comments I would like to make. And one is that even though I've never stepped onto Harvard's campus, and I've had an ambiguous relationship with the academy throughout my life, I owe such a debt of gratitude to you, and I wouldn't be who I am without mentioning Richard Evans Schultes, the renowned 20th century ethnobotanist, who is really the one individual who championed indigenous plant wisdom in the 20th century, and his protege Wade Davis, who has carried on his legacy. There are individuals like them who speak to my work so much more profoundly, and who I have such a debt of gratitude. And to offer up a thank you on behalf of and to my Shifu for all of his guidance, my mentor in the tea industry, and on behalf of Yunhai Zhidian, our tea house in China, I would like to say to everybody, Qingxin Danya, Yituan He Qi. And what that means, Qingxin, with a pure and unencumbered heart. The clear heart, Danya, bland elegance, just a simple, unadorned manner. Yituan He Qi, one circle in harmony. And on behalf of Emu, if I might presume, and the Mangjing village and the Jingmai Mountain Bulong community, just to offer up to everybody a single word that is a Theravada thank you that contains a blessing within. And we saw these images behind me earlier, and just to mention one final thing, over the course of this talk, I've spoken to the commingling, or Terry mentioned the commingling of emus in my agroforestry lineages. And I spoke to the commingling of the Eastern and Western histories of consciousness. And earlier this year, within 3 months of one another, Emu's patrilineal grandmother, who raised her, passed away. And my matrilineal grandfather, who raised me, passed away. Both of them at the age of 96 from having lived a long and full life. And so much of this, I can only dedicate this to the 2 of them on behalf of Emu and I, and to offer that up as a blessing to the global community, that it is possible for us to share in a common humanity and to become one family. And so with that, as I would always say to Grandma, Moon Raksa, thank you. And from the bottom of my heart, bless you all.